The flames roared higher, licking at the night sky, and I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the pyre of my clothes, the fabric curling and blackening in the heat. The sharp smell of burning cotton filled my nose, but it couldn't overpower the sting of betrayal that burned even deeper. My husband stood a few steps away, his face illuminated by the firelight. His voice was low but cold, cutting through the crackling fire like a blade. "Maybe now you'll remember your place," he said, his words heavy with venom. My heart clenched at the sound, each syllable a blow I hadn't seen coming. I searched his face for something familiar, a flicker of the man I married, the one who once laughed with me, promised me the world. But there was nothing, just emptiness, or maybe worse, conviction. Behind him, his mother stood in the shadows, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was sharper than his words, her presence a stamp of approval on the act unfolding before me. She didn't look at me, she looked through me as if I were less than a person, less than her maid. This wasn't just about the clothes, I knew it wasn't. This was about control, about dominance, about a battle I hadn't even realized I was fighting until now. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My life with him had always seemed so carefully built, so perfect on the outside, but this was the first crack in the facade. And as the fire consumed what was left of my independence, I realized it wasn't the only thing being destroyed tonight. Something deeper, something darker was about to rise from those ashes. As the fire finally died down, I stood in the yard, staring at the blackened heap of what used to be my belongings. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of smoke, and the once vibrant colors of my clothes had been reduced to ash and embers. My hands trembled as I knelt down, a lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow. I shouldn't have been searching. There was nothing left, nothing that could be saved. But my fingers moved anyway, sifting through the warm ashes, the brittle remnants crumbling under my touch. It felt like a hollow attempt to hold on to something, anything, that was mine. Then my fingers brushed against something solid, cool metal amidst the heat. I froze for a moment, then carefully pulled it free, brushing away soot to reveal a small, tarnished box. It didn't belong to me, that much I knew. The intricate design on its surface, a swirling pattern that seemed both delicate and deliberate, was nothing I'd ever seen before. I opened it with hesitant fingers. Inside was a photograph, curled and browned at the edges from the fire, but still intact enough to make out the faces. My husband was there, much younger, a boy of maybe 10 or 12. His arm was around a woman who wasn't his mother. She was smiling, a soft, genuine smile that looked out of place against the tension I now recognized in his young face. There was something written on the back of the photo. The ink was faint, but I could still read it. "For you, always." Love M.I. frowned, my mind racing. Who was this woman? And why had this box been hidden among my things? It didn't make sense, but something about it felt wrong. As I stared at the picture, I realized that it wasn't just a keepsake. It was a piece of something larger, something I wasn't meant to find. A secret, buried beneath layers of ash and lies. My husband's mother had been watching me all evening, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Now I understood why. This wasn't just a box, it was a warning, or maybe even a key. To what, I didn't know yet. But I was going to find out. It wasn't always like this. I think that's what hurts the most. When I married him, he was kind, gentle, even. The sort of man who'd hold my hand during a thunderstorm because he knew I hated the sound. The man who once stayed up all night fixing a broken heater just so I wouldn't wake up cold. That man feels like a distant memory now, replaced by someone I barely recognize. It started small. So small I didn't even realize what was happening. He'd make little comments, things I could brush off as stress or frustration. "You're spending too much time on yourself," he'd say when I dressed up to go out with friends. Why do you have to cook it that way? Mother says it's better her way." At first, I laughed it off, thinking he just missed his family or was adjusting to married life. But it didn't stop. Over time, those small comments grew sharper, more cutting. He started checking my phone, questioning who I talked to, where I went, what I was doing when he wasn't around. "It's just because I care," he'd say. But the warmth that used to back those words was gone. And then there was his mother. She always had a way of speaking that felt more like a command than a suggestion, but now it seemed like her voice was always in his ear. She'd whisper things to him when she thought I wasn't listening. Things about how I didn't respect him, how I wasn't fulfilling my duties as a wife, how a good woman would do more. I saw the way her words worked on him, planting seeds of doubt that grew into something darker. It wasn't just his words that changed, it was everything. The way he looked at me like I was a disappointment, the way his temper flared over the smallest things. And then came the fire, the moment I knew he wasn't the man I married anymore. It's like his mother had taken the kind, loving man I knew and twisted him into someone I didn't recognize, someone I was afraid of. And now, as I sit here, trying to piece together the shards of my life, I can't help but wonder, was this always who he was? Or did she make him this way? It happened on one of those quiet afternoons when the world outside felt calm, but my mind was anything but. I was still reeling from the fire, still trying to process everything. The burning clothes, my husband's cold words, his mother's silent approval. It felt like my life had been set ablaze along with my belongings, and I had no idea how to stop the flames from spreading. That's when Mrs. Bennet knocked on my door. She lived 2 houses down, a woman in her late 60s who always had a kind smile and a pie to share during the holidays. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the years, but nothing more. Yet here she was, standing on my doorstep, clutching a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden. "You look like you could use some company," she said, her voice soft but firm. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I stepped aside, letting her in, and we sat at the kitchen table, the basket untouched between us. For a while, she just talked about her garden, her grandchildren, the weather, normal things that felt so far removed from my reality. Then, as she poured herself a second cup of tea, her tone shifted. "You know," she began, her eyes meeting mine, "I've lived in this neighborhood a long time. I've seen families come and go, but your husband's family, they've always been different." I felt my stomach tighten. "Different how?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "His mother, she's not an easy woman, is she? Always been that way. She likes control and she gets it, one way or another." I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Bennet leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not the first, you know. There was someone before you, a young woman, pretty, full of life, married into that family, but she didn't last long." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" "She left," Mrs. Bennet said quickly, but the look in her eyes told me there was more to the story. Or at least, that's what they said. One day, she was just gone. No goodbye, no explanation. And the way his mother talked about her afterward, like she was some terrible person, it didn't sit right with me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because you remind me of her," she said simply, "and I don't want history to repeat itself." She didn't stay much longer after that, leaving me with more questions than answers. As I watched her walk back to her house, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her words lingered, wrapping around me like a warning I didn't fully understand. Who was this woman before me? What had really happened to her? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do now? It was one of those restless afternoons when the silence of the house felt louder than any noise. My husband was out, and his mother was in the garden, pruning her roses with an eerie sense of precision. I had no intention of snooping. I just wanted to clear my head. But as I wandered the upstairs hallway, my steps faltered in front of a door I'd always ignored. It was locked, as it always was, but something about it tugged at me that day. Maybe it was Mrs. Bennet's cryptic warning. Maybe it was the growing sense that this house held more secrets than I could bear. Whatever it was, I found myself gripping the handle, testing its resistance, before a thought struck me. I remembered seeing a set of keys on the kitchen counter earlier that morning. My mother-in-law had left them there, absent-mindedly, as she scolded me for folding the laundry wrong. Without giving myself time to rethink, I hurried downstairs, snatched the keys, and returned to the door. The lock clicked open with an unsettling ease. The air inside the room was stale, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The curtains were drawn, casting everything in a dim, almost otherworldly light. My first impression was that it seemed ordinary, too ordinary, like a carefully constructed facade. A neatly made bed, an old wooden dresser, a vanity covered in lace. But then I saw the wall. It was covered in photographs. Dozens of them, some framed, some simply pinned up. They were all of the same woman, the one from the photo I found in the ashes. She was younger in some, older in others, her smile bright, but her eyes troubled. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and noticed the notes scribbled beneath each picture. Perfect here. Too much makeup. Disrespectful. My stomach churned as I moved to the dresser. Inside, I found items that didn't belong to me, or to my mother-in-law for that matter. A silver locket, a pressed flower in a glass frame, a small notebook filled with entries that stopped abruptly. On the vanity there was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local woman disappears under mysterious circumstances." The picture beneath it was unmistakable. It was her. My hands trembled as I pieced it together. This room wasn't a guest room, as I'd always assumed. It was a shrine to the woman who came before me, the one who was just gone. And as I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of a life erased, I felt an icy certainty settle over me. Whatever had happened to her, I was dangerously close to being next. It was the kind of conversation you weren't supposed to overhear. I had gone to the local market to pick up a few things, hoping a walk outside the suffocating walls of my home would clear my mind. The fire, the locked room, the photograph, all of it was weighing on me, and I needed a moment to breathe. But as I stood near the vegetable stall, distractedly picking at a basket of tomatoes, I caught a snippet of conversation between two women nearby. They were older, with the kind of familiarity that only comes from years of living in the same town. "That family's always been trouble," one of them said, shaking her head. "You mean the Carmichaels?" the other replied. I froze. The Carmichaels, my husband's family. The first woman lowered her voice, but not enough to keep me from hearing. "Oh, yes. You remember what happened with that poor girl years ago? The first wife." My breath caught, and I forced myself to look busy, rearranging the tomatoes in my basket as my heart pounded in my chest. "Of course I remember," the second woman whispered. "Such a shame. They said she left him, but..." She trailed off, glancing around before leaning closer to her friend. "There were rumors, that she didn't leave at all, that something happened to her in that house." The first woman nodded grimly. "And the mother? Oh, she always gave me the creeps. So controlling, so odd. It's no wonder the poor girl couldn't take it. But to disappear like that, without a trace..." "She didn't disappear," the second one said firmly. "You know what they say. People don't just vanish." I felt my knees weaken, and I gripped the edge of the stall for support. They moved on to talk about something else, but their words stayed with me, echoing in my mind like a siren. I couldn't shake the thought. What if they were right? What if the first wife hadn't left willingly? What if she hadn't left at all? When I got home, I searched online, using every detail I could remember from the women's conversation. It didn't take long to find it. A grainy old newspaper clipping buried in an archive. The headline read, "Local woman missing. Husband claims she left town." There was her face again, staring back at me. The same woman from the locked room. The same woman from the ashes. The article was brief, almost dismissive, quoting my mother-in-law saying the girl was troubled and needed to find herself. There was no follow-up, no investigation, just silence. And now, years later, I was in her place, trapped in the same house, under the same roof, with the same people. My skin crawled as I realized the truth. I wasn't just unraveling a mystery. I was walking the same dangerous path. I didn't mean to overhear it, but there I was, standing in the hallway, frozen in place, unable to move. I had just come back from running errands, my mind still racing with the details I had uncovered. The photos, the locked room, the whispers at the market. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I thought I'd slip upstairs unnoticed. But then I heard their voices. My husband's voice, low and strained, and his mother's, sharp as ever. "You're still not doing enough," she said, her words like a whip. "She's too stubborn, too independent. Do you see how she looks at me, how she defies me? It's because of you, you know. You've failed her." I felt a chill creep up my spine as I pressed myself closer to the wall, trying not to breathe too loudly. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't pull away. I needed to hear what they were saying. "I'm trying, okay?" My husband's voice cracked. "I'm trying to keep it together." "But you're not," she spat back. "You're weak. You always have been. You know what happens when people like her don't fall in line. You remember what happened before, don't you?" I could hear the hesitation in his voice. I didn't mean for it to go that far, okay? I thought she'd be different. I thought she could handle it. But now it's happening again. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. What was he talking about? What was happening again? "You're just like your father," his mother sneered. "Weak, incapable of taking control. You have to fix this. I can't have her ruining everything we've worked for. Do you understand?" I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The pieces were falling into place, but it didn't make sense. Why was he saying these things? Was this all a game to him too? Or was he as trapped as I felt? "I don't know if I can," he said softly. "I don't know if I can go through with it again. I don't know if I can." His voice broke and I heard a sharp intake of breath. It was like he was on the edge of a confession, a secret he couldn't bear to keep any longer. His words hung in the air, thick with guilt, thick with fear. "I don't want to hurt her," he said, his voice so quiet now I could barely make it out. "I don't want to be like you, like him, but I don't have a choice, do I? I never have a choice." His words were a knife to my heart. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wasn't imagining it. He was torn. He didn't want to be part of whatever scheme his mother had been pulling, but he was, and it was slowly destroying him. And me. I didn't know what to do or if I could even trust him anymore. He wasn't just a victim. He was complicit, a pawn in his mother's game, but also a willing participant. And now I was caught in the middle of it all, just like the others before me. The door creaked as I backed away and I hurried upstairs, my heart heavy with the weight of the truth. Nothing was as it seemed, and I was running out of time. At first, I was paralyzed. Every move I made felt like it was being watched, every word I said carefully measured. The house, the fire, the pictures, the whispers. It all felt like a trap closing in around me. My husband was no longer the man I'd married, and his mother, well, she was a force I couldn't ignore, a presence that shadowed every corner of my life. I had no idea how I could fight back or even if I could. But somewhere between the discovery of the locked room and Mrs. Bennet's cryptic warning, something shifted inside me. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way my husband's hands shook when he thought I wasn't looking. The small, fleeting moments when his eyes would linger on me with something close to regret before he shut it down. His mother's constant surveillance had always been oppressive, but now I saw it for what it truly was, a means of control, a way to keep me caged and compliant. The realization that I wasn't just some passive victim, that I could fight back, was like a spark in the dark. I wasn't powerless, and I didn't have to play by their rules. They were both flawed, both weak in their own ways. My husband might have been manipulated, but he was still a grown man with choices. And his mother? She was a bully, and bullies always had weaknesses. It started small, little things that I knew would make a difference. I stopped reacting to his controlling demands the way I had before. When he told me what to wear, I smiled and ignored him. When he said I should make his mother's favorite dish again, I did it. But I made sure it was overcooked, and not how she liked it. At first, he didn't notice. He was too caught up in his mother's expectations, but I saw the frustration grow in his eyes when things didn't go the way he thought they would. Then came the subtle manipulations. I began to learn how to play their game, how to outsmart them at their own craft. I'd pretend to agree with his mother, nodding at her suggestions, giving her the illusion that she still had control. But behind the scenes, I quietly changed things. Little shifts, nothing too obvious, but enough to make them uncomfortable. One evening, when my husband and I were sitting at the dinner table, I listened to him rant about how everything was my fault, how I wasn't doing enough to fix things. He was angry, his words cutting deeper than I expected. But instead of cowering, I met his gaze steadily. "Maybe it's not me who's broken," I said softly. "Maybe it's you." He froze, his face twitching. For a split second, I saw the conflict in his eyes, the guilt, the realization. Then, just as quickly, the mask came back. He clenched his jaw, staring at his plate. But the seed had been planted. I could see it in the way he didn't meet my eyes anymore, in the way he seemed more unsure when his mother spoke. I knew that I couldn't confront them head on. Not yet. I wasn't ready for that battle, but I could weaken their hold piece by piece. I could create cracks in the walls they'd built around me. And every time my husband's words faltered or his mother's orders were ignored, I felt stronger. The next step came when I stopped letting them isolate me. I reached out to friends, people I hadn't spoken to in months, people who didn't know the version of me that had been cowed into submission. I spent time outside the house, in places where their influence didn't reach. Each phone call, each outing, was like breathing fresh air for the first time in ages. But I wasn't naive. I knew they would retaliate. I knew they would try to tighten their grip, to bring me back into their control. But I also knew something they didn't. I was no longer afraid. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning how to thrive, how to outmaneuver them, how to take back the pieces of my life that had been stolen. The real battle hadn't even started yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I had the upper hand. I was no longer just the woman they tried to break. I was the woman who was starting to fight back, and I wasn't going to stop. The moment I had been dreading for weeks arrived when I least expected it. After everything, the cryptic warnings, the subtle rebellions, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place, I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to face the truth head on. And I wasn't ready for it, but I had no choice. It started when I overheard my husband talking to his mother in the living room. His voice was tight, almost pleading. "We've been through this. You know what she's capable of. She won't just fall into line like the others. She's too smart for us." His mother's voice was cold, dismissive. "Don't be weak, son. We've done this before and we'll do it again. You will make her obey. You'll do what's necessary." I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I stood just out of sight, listening to their conversation, the truth slicing through me like a blade. There it was, the full weight of what I had been piecing together. My husband had never been a mere victim. He had been complicit. He had helped orchestrate all of it, the control, the manipulation, the terror, and now he was too deep to pull out. But his mother, she was the mastermind. She had created the monster, and she had used him as her puppet. She wasn't just controlling him, she was controlling everything, and I had been her target all along. I couldn't wait any longer. The time had come. I walked into the room, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no fear in me now, only determination. "You can stop pretending now," I said, my voice steady. Both of them turned to look at me, surprise flashing across their faces. My husband's jaw clenched and his mother's eyes narrowed. But there was something different now. The mask was slipping. "What are you talking about?" My husband's voice was defensive, but I could hear the strain underneath. "I know everything," I replied. "About her, about you, about everything." I stepped closer, locking eyes with his mother. "I know how you've controlled him, how you've manipulated him into doing your bidding, just like you did to the others before me. You've created a prison for him, a prison where he's too scared to break free, too weak to see the truth." Her smile was cold, calculating. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," I said, my voice rising. "You've done this before. I know what happened to your first daughter-in-law, and I know why she's gone. You buried the truth, just like you're trying to bury me. But I won't let you." For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, just a brief flash. She didn't expect me to know. She didn't expect me to figure it out. But I had. I turned to my husband, my gaze softening. "You're not a monster. You never were. You've been broken, manipulated by her. But you don't have to be anymore." His eyes darted back and forth between me and his mother, his lips trembling. I didn't want any of this. I never wanted to hurt you. It's not too late to stop," I said, my voice quieter now. "You still have a chance to make things right." But his mother stepped forward, her voice sharp as a whip. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything? You're nothing. You're just another pawn in this family's game." "Not anymore," I said, my voice steady and firm. "You've used your control over him for too long, and I'm done." I pulled out the photograph, the one I'd found in the locked room, the one that had connected everything. I slapped it down on the table. "This is your legacy. This is who you really are." The silence between us felt suffocating. I could feel the tension crackling in the air as the truth hung heavy between us. The revelation was undeniable. There was nowhere left for them to hide. "You'll never get away with this," I said, turning toward the door. "And I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. It's over." For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of the house, of the years of control, begin to lift. I wasn't going to be their prisoner anymore. I wasn't going to let them destroy me the way they destroyed the others. I stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat, and for the first time in so long, I felt free. The truth had been revealed and there was no going back.